Unfortunately, despite all our progress against ISIL on the battlefield and in the financial realm, our efforts have not reduced the group's terrorism capability and global reach. The resources needed for terrorism are very modest, and the group would have to suffer even heavier losses on territory, manpower, and money for its terrorist capacity to decline significantly.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. That was CIA Director Brennan telling Congress today that the Islamic State remains formidable and resilient. He claims they're training for further attacks on the West and will increasingly rely on guerrilla-style tactics to compensate for its territorial losses in the Middle East. The shockwaves of Sunday's terror attack in Orlando, Florida, continue to be felt here in the U.S. and around the world. How best to handle the threat of Islamic extremism has been the main topic of conversation in the news all week. For analysis, I'm joined by advisor to the Anti-Terrorism Caucus of the House of Representatives and a foreign policy advisor to Donald Trump, Dr. Walid Phares. Walid, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I almost thank myself for having you because I'm so excited. Let's talk for a moment. You heard Brennan say there, ISIS is increasing its reach. There is no seeming way to stop it. The war field doesn't seem to be gaining as much ground. The FBI has admitted to targeting 1,000 people that they consider on the terrorist watch list, people who have expressed a radicalization, but they don't have the manpower to surveil them. Is that all that ails us?
Well, if you combine the statements made by the CIA director about the expansion of ISIS to the statements made by the FBI director, we are going after them in all 50 states. What would that tell us? There is an all-out jihadi war against the United States government and people, and this is what we've seen in San Bernardino, what we saw in Orlando, and I'm very concerned, based on the statements of the two directors, that we're not winning that war, which means there will be more strikes coming.
And then there's, of course, the question of how people are viewing this, the political lens through which it's being observed, and that is critically important as well. Here's the first of the candidates I want to share with people. Following the attack in Orlando, Donald Trump had this to say about immigration and allowing certain Muslims into the United States. Watch.
When I'm elected, I will suspend immigration from areas of the world where there is a proven history of terrorism against the United States, Europe, or our allies, until we fully understand how to end these threats. We cannot continue to allow thousands upon thousands of people to pour into our country, many of whom have the same thought process as this savage killer. Many of the principles of radical Islam are incompatible with Western values and institutions.
President Obama said that is lumping together all people of one religion and condemning them and blaming them for these acts of violence. Is it? Does it?
I don't know if President Obama was listening or somebody was translating what Mr. Trump was saying. It's precisely the opposite. Mr. Trump said, number one, we are now going to focus on those coming from these countries where the terrorists rule or are in control, i.e. the jihadists. I could name 5, 6 of them. And then he said, we are going to be putting that ban on these countries with these groups until the government, meaning Mr. Obama's administration and bureaucracy, until Mr. Trump is in the White House, so that it could tell us, how do you measure? How do you make that distinction? I myself have spoken with many leaders in the Arab world, not just Europe and other countries, and we asked them, how do you do it? They said, first of all, what you need to do is to identify the ideology, and we're not. President Obama is opposed to identifying an ideology.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a moment. I want to share something with you, and as an advisor to Donald Trump, I wonder how this falls on your ears and what you make of this. This is Speaker Paul Ryan. He is one of many Republicans who are parting ways with Donald Trump, at least on this issue. Watch.
I do not think a Muslim ban is in our country's interest. I do not think it is reflective of our principles, not just as a party, but as a country. And I think the smarter way to go in all respects is to have a security test and not a religious test.
Is this a religious test that Mr. Trump is proposing?
No. This is a ban on jihadists. And to do a ban on jihadists, you have to have all the measures that you can. He was talking about the countries where these jihadists are coming to. And he has said already from last year, if you give me the actual instrument on how to distinguish, there will be no ban at all to begin with.
We know from reports I've been reading, more than 100 Syrian refugees are entering the United States every day. Now, that is in marked contrast to the numbers we've admitted in years past. We don't know who these people are. How do you screen them? I mean, obviously, there's a human rights worry here. There's a human rights concern. But how do you screen these people? How do you maintain their whereabouts when we have visa entries and we don't know where they are now?
Well, you have two parts for the problem. Problem number one, the administration is not telling us that they have an alternative solution for the refugees. So that we're not dealing with a humanitarian issue. I spoke with and I appeared with NGOs coming from Syria at the European Parliament and in Washington. And they said, we have an area in Syria which is the size of the Republic of Lebanon, 10,000 square kilometers. We are ready to host these people. We are ready to defend them. Actually, you have a no-fly zone over us. Actually, your forces are there to protect. So why is it that if you have an area ready to absorb those millions of refugees, your president and your administration are, decided to bring them to the United States? So that's number one. Number two, yes, we don't have a way to vet them. Because when we removed what is needed to vet them 7 years ago, which is the ideological factor, then we are facing a real problem here.
I want to run this by you. I want your reaction to this. This is Hillary Clinton. She claims that these are lone wolf attacks, okay? And this is how she characterized the Orlando attack on that gay bar there. Watch this.
The threat is metastasizing. We face a twisted ideology and poisoned psychology that inspires the so-called lone wolves, radicalized individuals who may or may not have contact and direction from any formal organization. We have to be just as adaptable and versatile as our enemies. As president, I will make identifying and stopping lone wolves a top priority.
She says she's going to make it a top priority. Here's the question. Is this a lone wolf attack? Is this just another individual sort of running out there and doing their own thing like the Aurora shooter?
Let me first raise what is the top priority of the top priority is for Secretary Clinton to tell us when she mentions this is a twisted ideology. Madam Secretary, what is it? What are its goals? Explain it to us, as others have explained Nazism, Bolshevism, fascism. It's not happening. Number two, with regard to the reality on the ground, there are no such thing as an absolute isolated lone wolf. A lone wolf who email, who text, who go on Facebook, who make phone calls, who travels twice to Saudi Arabia or to other countries is no more a lone wolf at the end of the day.
This is you see connective tissue between the Tsarnaev brothers, this Omar Mated, all of these people. You feel there's a connection here.
All these individuals that you have mentioned and others operate individually. It's a big difference between, it's like a commando sent by the command or in contact with the command that is operating for one suicide mission. They decided that he's going to do it on his own. That does not mean that he's a lone wolf isolated.
And how do you stop it? How do you intervene and stop this? I mean, Hillary Clinton does make the very interesting point. She said, look, Mr. Trump says he's going to build a wall. He can't build a wall around the internet, Walid. You would say what?
I would say release your allies in the internet, release the antidote. If you compare the internet as a human body, when you have an illness, what do? You release antidotes. Who are the antidotes? The Muslims, anti-jihadists. Did you meet with them, Madam Clinton? Did you meet with them or did you meet with the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafists? The choices are much higher. Who are our partners will determine how we're going to fight this battle against the jihadists.
Or not.
Or not.
I want to share this with you. This is President Obama speaking to the press today and survivors in Orlando, Florida, of that terrible attack. Listen to this.
Whatever the motivations of the killer, whatever influences led him down the path of violence and terror, whatever propaganda he was consuming from ISIL and Al-Qaeda, this was an act of terrorism, but it was also an act of hate. This was an attack on the LGBT community.
He says it's an attack on the LGBT community. Is that reductive? Is that enough?
It is a jihadi-motivated attack against the LGBT, in as much as there are jihadi-motivated and inspired attacks against Jews and Middle East Christians and Yazidis. What is important here is not what community is targeted. It's what ideology is commanding you to attack these communities.
Ah, interesting. Because otherwise, I mean, you'd have to step back and say, well, it was an attack on marathon runners.
Right.
It was an attack, or almost attack, on people who walked in Times Square. Attack on Christians in their churches. We're seeing this all over Africa and other places. And this would have to be an attack on the LGBT community.
Well, yes, but what is missing in this analysis is who is giving the validation. I mean, not everybody who dislike a specific community, and there are many people who are frustrated, who are, you know, not integrated enough. But what validates them is basically an ideology. If you do it, you will go to the rank of the superior people. That's how we feel.
The president said during his address, this same address, motives are different, but the instruments are similar, meaning guns. Valid analysis?
That's the history of the whole world. I mean, we're going to ban all the guns and the tanks of the world and we solve the problem. No, you're going to ban actually or work against the intentions, the ideological intentions, the social intentions, the aggressive intentions. I mean, our war in World War II was against the super tiger or was against the Nazi ideology?
I want to share this with you. This is a statement, and it really speaks again, trying to explain what drove or motivated this violence. And you're getting tons of people sort of putting forward their own pet agendas, pet explanations of what might have been driving this insane person to walk into this club and wipe out almost 50 people. This is Bishop Robert Lynch from the Diocese of St. Petersburg, Florida. He released a column, a statement, and he said, sadly, it is religion, including our own, which targets mostly verbally and also often breeds contempt for gays, lesbians, and transgender people. Attacks today on LGBT men and women often plant the seed of contempt, then hatred, which ultimately lead to violence. Are people of faith to blame for what we saw in Orlando, what we saw at the Boston Marathon?
What ultimately lead to violence is a specific ideological injunction. It's true that there are frustration and people who are not happy with other people. That's the history of
and people who hate.
And people who hate. That's the history of mankind. But I would refer the bishop to the videotapes online of Iranians hanging gays and lesbians in Iran, of ISIS throwing those gays from the buildings. The inspiration there is specifically an ideology. It's not that individually these people are doing that as a crime. They think that they are doing an accomplishment of an ideology.
Yeah, I mean, just stepping back rationally looking at this, I mean, it's not the Presbyterians or the, Seventh-day Adventists going into clubs and shooting people whose lifestyle they may have some difficulties with. Yeah. Doesn't mean they wish those people dead. And I think it's a bit of a stretch. I mean, I don't see bishops taking, arms and going into the streets and shooting whoever they might disagree with more. I mean, my gosh, if sin becomes the injunction to kill, everyone would have to be mowed down. It also smells to me a little bit like the Benghazi explanation. Coming right after the Benghazi attack, you'll remember, it was the videotape that was to blame. Yeah. In fact, the videotape was not an issue at all.
Well, look, every time there is a jihadi attack here, the camp that does not want to recognize the ideology goes on a volley of reason that have nothing to do with it. We saw it over the past many attacks. Oh, the Tsarnaev were frustrated immigrant. The guy in California and his wife had different reasons. They cannot see the common thread, which is an ideology and a target in a war against us, which the two major directors of national security have been warning us about.
I want to talk about terminology for a moment, identifying this for whatever it is or isn't. This term radical Islam has been bounced around a lot. We heard Donald Trump say how important it is to identify these terrorist attacks as such, driven by radical Islam. The president took a slightly different view. Watch.
There's no magic to the phrase radical Islam. It's a political talking point. It's not a strategy. And the reason I am careful about how I describe this threat has nothing to do with political correctness and everything to do with actually defeating extremism.
Does that approach defeat extremism, and why is terminology important? Does it matter what you call it?
I think President Obama is very isolated in his statement, because if you go to France, what they use is Islamist Islamism. Great Britain, the same. Russia does the same. India, China, we're almost 90% of the world. But better than that, the Arab moderates. If you go to Egypt, what do you think the president of Egypt and the Grand Imam, the equivalent of the Sunni Pope, say? And he told me when I visited Egypt, he called them Islamist, jihadist, Salafi, takfiri. So why on earth the entire planet calls them with their names, and only the president of the United States and his advisors refuse to do so?
So why the reticence? Why this language? I mean, he says he's doing it intentionally, being careful. Is this a workable and smart approach on some level?
He has chosen that path based on the advice he gotten since 2009. And I think at the end of his mandate as presidency, he's not going to change it, because he will have to re-explain everything all the way till June of 2009, when he went to Egypt, met with the mostly Muslim Brotherhood in the audience, and delivered that speech, and then sent a letter to the Ayatollah Khamenei. So that would be very difficult for his political ship to change now at the end of his 8th year.
Before I let you go, the Prime Minister of Canada, Trudeau, made a statement where he was unwilling to acknowledge that there is a genocide taking place in Syria, in Iraq, against Yazidis and Christians. This has sparked something of a backlash.
This is inexplicable. And out of all countries and governments, Canada, who was known to be a leading force for human rights, to deny that there was a genocide at the hands of the Caliphate of ISIS against specifically the Yazidis and the Christians, after the Security Council, the European Parliament, Congress, and others, and even the State Department now are considering that this is a genocide, inexplicable.
Yeah. We will leave it there. Walid Phares, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Walid's latest book, The Lost Spring, U.S. Policy in the Middle East and Catastrophes to Avoid, is still available at bookstores everywhere and online.